Morning and welcome to the Center for American Progress. We're going to get started in just a minute, but before we do, we ask that you please take your seats and silence all your cell phones. There will be two Q&A portions, I believe, for this program. We ask that you state your name and affiliation before asking your brief question. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera, Tanden, and I'm president of the Center for American Progress. And I'm so glad to host this discussion today of a critical challenge confronting the international community. During recent years, we have witnessed an alarming erosion of democratic values in governments across the world. In Europe, we've seen the rise of xenophobic, far-right parties working to stifle liberal norms in places such as Hungary, Germany, Italy, and Poland. In Asia, we've witnessed attacks against human rights in countries such as China and Myanmar, along with backsliding democratic freedoms in Thailand and the Philippines. And here in the United States, we have a president in office who freely praises authoritarian rulers such as Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, and who openly asks the government of China and Ukraine to launch baseless investigations against a potential rival for the White House. In the face of everything that's now unfolding, it is absolutely essential for progressive leaders in every corner of the globe to come together and reaffirm our commitment to protecting the rule of law and to advancing liberal democracy. This includes strengthening America's pivotal alliance with Japan, which has helped provide a foundation for peace and stability in Asia and beyond for more than 7 decades. That is why CAP is thrilled today to host today's conversation and to welcome an amazing group of panelists who are working on the front lines of this effort. That's why I'm particularly honored to welcome our keynote speaker for this morning, Senator Ed Markey. As ranking member of the Senate Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy, Senator Markey stands as an important progressive voice on matters of foreign policy. He's played a leading role in trying to halt the spread of nuclear weapons to countries such as Iran and North Korea. He has been an outspoken supporter of the international effort to combat global warming and climate change, and he's been a staunch advocate for human rights, from opposing discrimination against women to defending ethnic minorities and LGBTQ communities throughout the world. We're so grateful for all of his leadership, and we're particularly pleased he could join us this morning. So please give a warm welcome to my home state senator from Massachusetts, Senator Ed Markey.
Thank you, Neera, so much. Thank you to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for inviting me here today to speak to you on this incredibly important issue. I'm so proud to have been invited to be here. CAP, under Neera's watch, continues to set the standard for thought leadership on a wide range of important policy issues, though I had hoped that given the proximity to the White House, that more of this thought had, in fact, made it into the White House deliberation rooms. However, we just have to wait approximately 1 year from today in order for the rate of that thought to begin to go into that building. And that's a topic for another day. But without question, what we're discussing today is a part of the anticipatory thinking that we need to do in order to make sure that we get policies correct, not just in Asia, but across the world and in our own domestic policies as well. It's great to be here as well with my old friend, Rudy DeLeon, who is joining us here today. And I thank you so much, Rudy, for your friendship and for your guidance over the years as well. Thank you. Today, I am honored to speak with you about how best to promote good governance and human rights in Asia. As the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations East Asia Subcommittee, I have a very good vantage point thinking about those issues. Unfortunately, what I am seeing is a cause for concern. It is clear to me that how we approach the challenges in the region will have significant consequences not only for the United States, but also for the very nature of the international order. Upholding and strengthening that order will not be possible without close allies like Japan. So I'm happy that our Japanese friends are playing a key role on those issues. As you know, in the wake of World War II, we were the architects of the rules, the norms, the structures that promoted values and principles that would provide benefits to the United States and to the world. We advocated for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, universal values for all people. Today, still guided by those values, we want governments, including in Asia, to be transparent and accountable, equitable and inclusive, and to follow the rule of law. Throughout the region, we see some positive developments. Many free and open societies in Asia are flourishing, from vibrant democracies in Japan and South Korea to Taiwan, which this past spring became the first Asian legislature to legalize same-sex marriage. The Malaysian people went to the polls in May of 2018 and peacefully ousted an incumbent prime minister who has since been charged with 42 criminal offenses as part of a larger scheme that bilked the Malaysian people of billions of dollars. These are unequivocal victories for democracy and the rule of law in Asia. But make no mistake, we are at an inflection point. It's no exaggeration to say that the future of freedom in the region is at stake. Sadly, authoritarian rule in Asia is not new, but it is also on the rise. The Chinese Communist Party is steadily reducing Hong Kong's autonomy. What started ostensibly as a reaction to an extradition bill clearly is about protecting the fundamental and universal rights that all human beings want. As a result, a tidal wave is washing over Hong Kong as its citizens take great personal risk to demand universal suffrage and genuine democracy. Last night, President Xi told Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's chief executive, that Beijing had a, quote, high degree of trust in her. But it is clear that everyone else that neither of the current governments in Beijing or Hong Kong are willing to protect and defend human rights and democracy. It seems then that the rights and freedoms enshrined in the basic law, Hong Kong's mini constitution that came into effect at the British handover in 1997, may only last less than half of the promised 50 years. There are 28 years left in that agreement. How will the United States and the world act to ensure those rights are protected? 22 years have already elapsed, 28 years left to go in that agreement, and already the Chinese government in Beijing are closing in on all of those rights that were protected. And in Xinjiang province, the CCP not only has incarcerated up to 2 million Uighurs and other Central Asian minorities, but also is carrying out a broader campaign to erase their cultures and the Islamic faith from China. This is the opposite of inclusion. And often it takes courageous and intrepid journalists, along with satellite imagery, to uncover those crimes which the government tries to hide. That is the opposite of transparency. But government crackdowns extend beyond China. We are all aware of the brutal repression of the North Korean regime and its infamous prison camps. The Rohingya have been the victims of what I consider to be genocide at the hands of Burma's military. In the Philippines, President Duterte has ruthlessly pursued a campaign of extrajudicial killings and a follow-on campaign to silence the critics of the violence. Hun Sen continues to rule Cambodia with an iron fist, banning the main opposition party and imprisoning political rivals. Structural changes to Thailand's constitution have set back democracy in that country, allowing the ruling junta to stay in power. In Kashmir, Prime Minister Modi is marginalizing Muslims through his efforts to curb freedoms and restrict rights in the disputed territories. Journalists around the region are not free to report the facts and face threats of violence for simply doing their jobs. Citizens in too many places in Asia face communication blackouts when government officials refuse to tolerate rightful criticism of their actions. And an ever stronger and more prosperous China is emboldening dictators and despots. But we can't simply focus on the challenges within the region. The Chinese government is exporting its problematic governance practices abroad by providing advanced surveillance technology and training foreign officials to create vast databases of personal information. The Chinese government is pushing a different set of values. And by installing Huawei equipment in their 5G backbones, countries around the world risk exposing sensitive information to Beijing authorities. Worse, Chinese largesse effectively erases criticism of Beijing's authoritarian tendencies, as we saw when almost twice as many countries defended Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs, then criticized it. And here at home, the White House fails to strongly advocate for the principles of good governance. In fact, the Trump administration actively sends the wrong signals. President Trump explicitly asked presidents of Ukraine and China to conduct investigations into the family members of a political rival. Requesting foreign government interference in American democracy communicates a dangerous and damaging message to countries that look to justify their own corrupt practices. And such actions undermine State Department efforts to promote good governance and condemn corruption. Furthermore, President Trump appears to have promised President Xi that he would remain silent about the demonstrations in Hong Kong during trade negotiations, suggesting that the United States would sacrifice its principles for an interim deal. And when the President of the United States referred to the Hong Kong protests as, quote, riots, and said that China, quote, will have to deal with that themselves, he gave a green light to President Xi at the very moment that a Democratic leader should have been standing up for freedom. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross echoed this, saying that the Hong Kong issue is, quote, an internal matter for China to deal with. That same Secretary Ross is the messenger the president chose to represent the United States at this week's summit in Thailand. As you know, President Trump decided against attending this week's East Asia summit, sending instead the lowest ranking delegation of all time to that conference. The president's absence sends the signal that the United States is not prioritizing Asia. But it also robs us of the opportunity to forcefully advocate for inclusive, transparent, and just government policies throughout that region. In fact, out of the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, only the leaders from Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam showed up for the summit with National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, who also is in attendance on behalf of President Trump. When America doesn't show up at the highest levels, who benefits? And who is going to respond to anything that the United States says? What credibility will the United States have on key policy issues? And in cases where the Trump administration has highlighted human rights violations, it has fallen short on policy implementation. Too often, the administration's steps are insufficient or they are delayed. For example, years after we learned of the first credible reports of Chinese government atrocities against the Uighurs, the Trump administration finally announced some financial measures to hold officials and companies to account. But those steps have not included global Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese officials, something that I, along with others in Congress and in the human rights community, continue to urge. Similarly, the Trump administration instituted travel bans on senior officials in Burma responsible for the atrocities against the Rohingya, but also decided against global Magnitsky sanctions despite an abundance of evidence. We need our allies from Europe to Asia to help to do the same. And of course, for 3 successive years, the White House has requested significant cuts to the international affairs budget, which includes key programs and other funding streams to promote democracy and human rights in Asia and beyond. I traveled with President Clinton in 1998 to China for 10 days. The congressional delegation accompanying him, along with Madeleine Albright, as Secretary of State, was Lee Hamilton, myself, Max Baucus, and John Dingell. So for 10 days, we met with the Chinese, with the president, and they made it quite clear that they had just learned from what happened in Russia. Perestroika was to redo their economy and to restructure it, and glasnost was openness. What they made quite clear to us at that time, that they were going to restructure for certain, but they thought that glasnost had been a mistake. Putin clearly believes the same thing. But we are now dealing with that, where a restructured economy becomes more and more of a powerhouse, but human rights, the ability to speak, the ability to be able to express yourself is compromised. But that was their plan right from the beginning. They told us that in 1998. This still kind of a delusion that we're operating under, that capitalism somehow or other promotes democracy. That is not the case in China, and it's not the case in many other parts of the world. And there are many who still harbor this delusion that there is somehow or other a connection. There is not necessarily, and China proves that on a daily basis, which puts a greater burden on the United States to play a role intervening to make sure that those rights, those democratic values, those human rights values are in fact advocated for, because if we don't do it, it is not going to happen internally in many of these countries. So we need our allies from Europe to Asia to help us to do the same thing in intervening on an ongoing basis. And of course, this is not going to happen easily. So there are challenges. And with that challenge comes opportunity, the opportunity to do better. First, the Trump administration must change its rhetoric on governance, human rights, and democracy issues. We simply cannot have the President of the United States undermining the work of our experts and our diplomats by trying to promote our interests and values and improve the lives of countless people around the world. We must recognize the career professionals who work tirelessly to formulate and implement American foreign policy, including the promotion of good governance principles in Asia. They are not part of the deep state, or as White House spokesperson Stephanie Grisham called them, quote, radical, unelected bureaucrats. And secondly, because changing rhetoric isn't enough, we must resource those efforts. We need to not just sustain, but increase support for the international affairs budget, including those programs and initiatives to promote good governance, human rights, and democracy. That's why Senator Gardner and I introduced the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, which authorized $7.5 billion, including to help promote the rules-based order, defend human rights, and advocate for democratic values. That is now the law. It was signed into law last December, $7.5 billion to help promote those goals in Asia. But that's only a beginning. We must ramp up our efforts. And while it won't make up for the underfunded American programs, coordinated more closely with like-minded allies such as Japan, will build on our existing efforts. But we must support programs that have mutual benefit for the United States and the region, such as the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. I was proud to co-sponsor a Senate resolution recognizing the benefits of the program, which provides civic leadership and entrepreneurship training, as well as academic and professional exchanges. After all, people-to-people exchanges are one of the best ways to promote universal values. And third, as it is unlikely that the White House will change its messaging or request more funding, Congress, a co-equal branch of government, must do more. And that includes legislation. For example, the Senate must pass the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act as soon as possible. The House already passed its version, and we need Senator McConnell to take action in the Senate now. Similarly, I have introduced a resolution condemning the detention of Philippine Senator Leila de Lima and urging the Duterte government to end her unjustified imprisonment. We need to continue to strengthen relations with countries throughout that region by standing up for our values. But building alliances and partnerships can't come at the expense of the values and principles we want to protect and defend. And although the administration in many cases already has the authority it needs to use sanctions to change behavior, it does not exercise those authorities. So Congress has an obligation to call for such efforts, not for punitive purposes, but to shape behavior. For example, given the twin imperatives of addressing the climate crisis and promoting good governance, we should consider imposing sanctions on those engaged in corruption in the energy sector, including in Asia, where such actions have had deleterious effects on the climate and environment. If a person or company has contributed egregiously to carbon emissions by selling dirty power plants, the United States should be able to restrict their access to our financial system, especially when corruption is involved. We need to be leaders on climate. The president has now given notice that the 1 year notice that is needed to withdraw from the Paris Agreement is now ticking. And we are going to have a debate across the United States on climate change, on the climate crisis for the next year. And it is absolutely imperative for us to understand that if we don't lead, no one will follow. That the only reason there is a Paris Agreement is the leadership that President Obama and the United States gave to the construction of that treaty. Climate crisis is the #1 national security, health, environment, economic, and moral issue of our time. And we cannot expect the Chinese or others to follow if we are not leading. We cannot expect them to truly take advantage of this opportunity to create jobs in the United States if we are not, in fact, making other countries do so as well. Otherwise, we run the risk of the Chinese and others creating new jobs and export technologies to their advantage without them actually lowering their emission standards to meet the magnitude of the challenge. And the United States will both run the risk of the danger of climate change and not get the economic opportunity. So this is a big moment where we see the Chinese selling their old nuclear power, their old coal-burning plants, for example, into Kenya, as though they're doing a favor for these countries where renewables would be a far better avenue. And if the United States does not stand up, then we're going to wind up missing the opportunities for these new technologies to be deployed and that we played a role in gaining some of the economic benefit. So from my perspective, we're at this incredible inflection point in our history and in the globe's history. We have seen the kind of action that the Chinese government efforts have taken as part of their Belt and Road Initiative to pretend that publicly they are in favor of a renewables revolution while just selling their old coal plants like jalopies, around the world, doing a favor to these countries that are trying to expand. It is absolutely wrong. And I will soon introduce legislation to help to address this issue and to sanction actions of this nature. And finally, we need to hold tech companies to account for their role in the spread of hatred and undermining of democratic values. For example, the Chinese government's official press agency depicted the Hong Kong protesters as cockroaches. Other official outlets have used the platform to suggest those advocating for universal human rights are on a par with those responsible for Nazi oppression. So I recently wrote a letter to Mark Zuckerberg asking him to ban state-controlled media organizations from advertising on Facebook. Following my letter, Facebook announced that it would begin labeling ads from state-run media outlets. But labeling helps, but it isn't enough. Facebook is failing democracy in America and in Hong Kong, where it will continue to run Chinese Communist Party bot propaganda. Simply put, state-controlled ads must be banned from Facebook. In sum, we have a long way to go to help bring about the region and the world that we want to see. One where we empower American diplomats to address vexing governance problems, where we promote the health and well-being of countless individuals across the most heavily populated region of the planet, where we assist people in seeking freedom and economic opportunity, and where we stand up for the rule of law for all people, no matter their race, or their ethnicity, or their religion. We should be devoted to addressing those challenges because we recognize that the region is more peaceful when it operates by the principles and values we collectively cherish. Because there should be no place in the modern world for powerful countries using the threat of force to coerce smaller neighbors. No room for dictatorships to discriminate against, falsely imprison, torture, or kill their own citizens. And no room for the old ways of might makes right. Instead, we should use every chance that we have for creative, forward-looking solutions, for preserving the independence and freedom of action for those living under oppression, and for forging stronger partnerships with like-minded countries towards common goals. Given its power and influence, the United States has an obligation to promote principles of good governance. Ceding leadership will only lead to a resurgence of the behaviors we have so long fought against. So thank you all for your efforts here at CAP and for all of the organizations that you represent here, because it's through you that these human rights are going to be advanced and protected across the whole planet, that rule of law in Asia will continue to advance, and where we will look back at this period of time as a place where the United States did not retreat, but advanced in the principles that we believe in. We thank all of you at CAP for everything you do, and thank you, Neera, for giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you so much. Okay, oh, great. Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Thank you all. Thank you.
Hello. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Mike Fuchs. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center for American Progress. And again, very happy to have everyone here this morning for what was I thought, a very interesting and substantive speech by Senator Markey. And we have a equally substantive and all-star panel here joining us this morning to discuss everything going on with respect to democracy and human rights in Asia. To my immediate right is Abby Seif, who is with the Asia Society in New York. She is also an award-winning journalist who used to work in Southeast Asia. She is the former deputy national news editor for the Phnom Penh Post in Cambodia. Also, to her right, Uighurs Zaya, who's the president and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and also former acting assistant secretary of democracy, human rights, and labor at the State Department, amongst many other esteemed positions at the State Department. And to her right is Maiko Ishihara, who is a visiting scholar at Stanford University and also an associate professor at Totsubashi University in Japan. We have again, a tremendous wealth of knowledge and expertise here on the panel, and so I wanted to really just jump right in to some of the biggest questions that Senator Markey was touching on here today. He talked about this being an inflection point for democracy and human rights in Asia, and that being illustrative of broader struggles going on in the world today. And so I thought I'd start by asking our panel what you think about that right now, and the title, frankly, of this event, supporting good governance and human rights in a time of crisis. Are we in a time of crisis right now when it comes to democracy and human rights in Asia? Or is this sort of more of what we've just seen over the years and decades in the fits and starts of progress and backsliding in Asia? And so maybe I'll start with Abby.
This is on. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I guess it depends how far back we look. For instance, with Rohingya, we had a very similar military action in the late 70s. We've certainly seen China commit horrible human rights atrocities over the years. In Cambodia, history is pretty cyclical, so we see this over and over. But I guess in some ways, it doesn't matter. What matters is happening now, and if there is some kind of backslide over the last 5 or 10 or 15 years, or even if there's not, we just looking at the face of it, we can say the human rights situation is not doing well. The people who are struggling with this are not doing well, and then it's the question of what we can do to support and fight against that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think the people there obviously are struggling in many places. Some are better off than they were, years, decades ago, but others clearly far, far worse off. So, let's try to know you.
Yeah, I would have to weigh in for my own experience, both being on the governmental side, responsible for, the strategic worldwide State Department approach on human rights, and now being on the non-governmental side, leading a network of very committed actors working to use nonviolent means to sustain peace and end violent conflict. I do think we're at an inflection point. And if anything, I think that we are in the context of a questioning of status quo institutions and the tendency to view democratization as sort of the end of authoritarian systems, when it's really a long-term, rocky journey that is quite disruptive and opens up a whole new host of challenges. To me, the Myanmar case is emblematic. Having worked in the Obama administration during a period, I would say, of great hope, where a concerted American carrot and stick approach through the lifting of sanctions linked to concrete steps of release of all political prisoners, of opening the political system, obviously of releasing Aung San Suu Kyi, created an opening that ultimately didn't address so many of the fundamentally destabilizing factors, but the very nature of the military regime and its reach. So if anything, I feel that this inflection point is maybe somewhat of a sobering one, where as an optimist by nature, I think we can rethink some of our own approaches, and particularly when it comes to democratization, to get beyond the electoral frame, what I sometimes call one man, one vote, one time, to recognize that we are living in an age where we have just a whole set of elected authoritarians, whether it's Duterte. I personally would put Modi in that category, where we have to recognize that within democratic systems there is a corollary risk of majoritarianism and the manipulation or subversion of democratic institutions to consolidate power.
No, I think that's a really great point. And Mike, I was curious for your thoughts on this too. I mean, in the United States nowadays, in Europe, we seem to talk in the last couple of years a lot about the sort of populist tide that seemed to have swept over the last few years a number of countries in Europe and the United States. Do you think that what's happening in Asia, what you see happening in Asia, is something similar? Is it a trend? Is it connected amongst what's happening in a number of these countries, or are they sort of all isolated events?
I think there's these are not isolated trends, but they are all connected, and that's the problem. I believe, and there are three ways that these trends are interconnected and also spreading. One is the spillover effect of populism. Other country populism can be easily mimicked, and so that's how populism expands. And another thing is that the spread of the social media use and AI, as Senator was talking about, has been spreading the use of trolls and bots to manipulate information and impressions, and also spreading disinformation as well. And so that's easily used for again, populist political intentions as well. And thirdly, there have been expanding interference of external actors, especially China and Russia. For example, China has been interfering into elections in Asian countries like Cambodia, Taiwan, and also has been disrupting pro-democracy actors in the Asian region. In addition to other countries, China has been assisting. It has been conducting legal training and also conducting governance assistance in a large scale since mid-2000s, which we have to actually conduct more research about because there's a possibility that it's been spreading rule by law approach. And also the fact that those institutions as Confucius Institutes and CCTV have been spreading pro-China sort of images is sort of supporting supporting this favorable view about Beijing consensus. So that those are the worrisome sort of
You're talking about China. It's obviously the elephant in the room, I think, when it comes to talking about anything in Asia these days, but in particular human rights, obviously. Largest country in the world, itself has a pretty severe autocratic system, but also the way in which, as you were alluding to, it is promoting some aspects of its own autocratic system through the surveillance state and some of its political diplomacy in other countries. And so I'm curious for your thoughts, all of you, on how the United States and other countries should be seeing the China challenge when it comes to human rights. Right now, obviously, we're talking about Hong Kong. We're talking about, what Senator Markey said was an estimated 2 million Uighurs and other ethnic minorities in Xinjiang in what some describe as virtual concentration camps. And it seems the challenges can seem so daunting sometimes, and we have so much else going on with China, obviously. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that. Maybe start, Uzra, from your time in government, obviously dealing with these issues, what your thoughts are.
Sure. No, I'm happy to speak on this, and I had the personal experience. I led U.S. human rights dialogues with China for the period 2012 to early 2014, and so this is obviously an integral disconnect.
What were those like? If I could just ask quickly.
Tough, I would say. I would sum up in a word, but I think they're vitally important because, in my view, if we talk about the U.S. Japan alliance or like-minded partners for the United States, it's important that when we engage on the tough questions as well. And I think fundamentally, with respect to how we managed that dialogue with China, it was a combination of trying to call attention to the numerous and still continuing cases of political prisoners. The crisis in Xinjiang, while absolutely appalling, it didn't begin, in the last couple of years. You had a figure, Ilham Tohti, who was arrested in 2013 when I was responsible for the Human Rights Bureau. He's emblematic of what I would say the solution is in terms of brave citizens who are seeking dialogue, who are seeking to peacefully resolve grievances between, the Uyghur majority in Xinjiang, the Han. There are all kinds of ethnic divisions in addition to citizens in the state. But at that time, and for many years, there's just been a coercive system of state repression of just the most basic expressions of religious freedom, such as praying or taking the veil or fasting for Ramadan. So you have citizens in China, incredibly courageous human rights defenders, who are trying to hold their government to account under Chinese law and also under the international commitments that China has made as a UN member state. So I would say the overall tenor of our dialogue with China and human rights, while quite difficult at times, was to try to make the case that this was in China's interest, that this was consistent with China's commitments, and that ultimately the Chinese government could not solve all of the problems for the country, and they had to allow their citizens the space to hold government accountable to carry the society forward. So while there were very difficult aspects with respect to calling out the numerous political prisoner cases, suppression of fundamental freedoms, we also looked for opportunities to move forward on what I would call more wedge human rights issues, such as gender equality, the rights of persons with disabilities, countering domestic violence, because I think in that engagement, it isn't only a government-to-government one, but I believe civil society actors, even think tanks like CAP and others in Washington, other organizations seeking to solve these societal problems, I believe there is a path forward in trying to promote that kind of engagement, including when it's difficult conversations.
Michael, what about Japan and its view of China when it comes to human rights? Obviously, Japan is quite alert when it comes to the challenges presented by China. How does it view the human rights challenges?
far as I understand, there's not much statements expressed about China's human rights issues from the Japanese government. However, the overall take about human rights violation in China, within the Japanese society, is exactly the same as in the United States. Human rights violations in Xinjiang is apparently one of the hot topics in the Japanese media, and Hong Kong is covered really densely within the Japanese society, and people understand that what's happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong will be the future for Taiwan. So we are very closely looking at those cases. However, given that Japan's trade relations with China is growing, and now about 20% of Japanese trade is with China, and China is the top trading partner for Japan. There has been call from the business sector that Japan should maintain sort of warm relationship with China. So that's the challenge for the Japanese government, I believe. And so I believe that was why the Japanese government joined 22 other countries to make a statement about Xinjiang just at the end of October in the United Nations General Assembly. And this kind of multilateral approach seems to be the way forward for Japan.
And Abby, curious for your thoughts on China, and in particular, if you're able to add from your time in Southeast Asia as well, what you sort of see, if at all, China's role in its relationships with those countries when it comes to human rights and how they treat their people and what China prioritizes.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from Cambodia in particular, China's become a very attractive partner because of their human rights issues, because they're the no strings attached partner. They don't they don't require any level of quid pro quo the way America typically did, and and this is appealing. China is very proud of its non-interference when it comes to these countries, but I think the U.S. the role that it has to play is that I don't think many of these countries are ready to completely drop the United States or Europe or Australia or Japan. I think as much as they're getting from China, they know that this is they don't want to be a vassal state, and so this is where Western democratic or Eastern democratic nations can step in and kind of provide a pathway, because I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, well, actually, I want to pick up on that and maybe turn to Cambodia, talking about your Cambodia experience in, I think, a few days, right? We're expecting the potential return of a number of opposition leaders coming back to Cambodia, and Hun Sen has been threatening their return, obviously with increasing crackdowns in the last few years there. First of all, I'm curious for your thoughts on that and what you expect to see, but also more generally about what, if anything, you think the United States, Japan, other countries that Cambodia still wants good relationships with can do when it comes to acute situations like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two factors at play. One is whether or not these countries can do anything. It's very important for people on the ground to feel that they are being supported. And there's a reason that, Hong Kong was calling for the international community to stand up on its behalf. Yes, there's things like targeted sanctions and Global Magnitsky Act and this type of specific act, but also just paying attention, watching, speaking out. As journalists, we joke about these strongly worded statements, but for people on the ground, these mean a lot. And
as a former State Department person who spent a lot of time doing statements, it's good to hear people actually pay attention.
Yeah, and their absence is equally noted. And I think under this administration, there has been it's been quiet, and it's sort of a bit of a maybe moral vacuum that's seen. With regards to Sam Rainsy returning, I would not venture to predict anything about Cambodia. I think the government has laid the groundwork to give him an out by making it illegal for any plane to board him. I don't know if they would try an overland passage. I think regardless of what happens, it's CNRP members and activists in the country who are really paying the price of this. And it's sad to see, and I wonder what the impact will be for Kem Sokha, who's been under house arrest for 2 years. And
Well, Israel and Maiko, I'm curious for your thoughts on Cambodia and the situation there, but also then broadening it back out to Thailand and the Philippines. These are two U.S. allies. Senator Markey obviously talked about them, and sometimes I find these being some of the most difficult situations. These are two close, long-standing U.S. military allies who in the last half-decade have regressed significantly when it comes to democracy and human rights. And so you see the United States responding with sort of a, in fits and starts, trying to tailor its relationship but not sever it, obviously, to balance. So curious for your thoughts on how the United States and Japan and other countries should be dealing with situations like that.
I mean, one observation I would make, Mike, in these situations, whether it's Cambodia or, long-term U.S. Strategic allies like the Philippines and Thailand, is to not overlook the role of civil society and the idea that as governments, we can do both. It isn't a question of making a choice between, a harmonious relationship with a government that's engaging in repressive practices and not engaging the civil society actors on the ground who ultimately, they are the leaders. They are the force to hold their governments accountable. And there's just remarkable, I would say, peace-building work being done in all three countries, whether it is with respect to labor rights in Cambodia, land rights that are often at the root of some of the intercommunal conflicts or tensions that can easily be exploited by authoritarian actors. The closing space for journalists, the Maria Ressa case in the Philippines. I think that as governmental players, you've got to be able to look at the bigger picture and to recognize that it isn't simply a negotiation between a foreign government and the government in question, but it's trying to create the space or protect the space for local leaders on the grounds to move forward. And with that, I would reiterate Senator's point in terms of the imperative for sustained investment. Across the board, we've seen a retreat of U.S. leadership, whether it's in the Human Rights Council, slashing the international organization's budget. You have a country like Japan that remains the number 2 contributor overall to the UN budget, but there are other vehicles, too, that it's not always in a bilateral context. You have the UN Peacebuilding Fund, which is a growing now over $100 million fund designed to address some of these long-term, what I would call drivers of conflict, but also the potential paths to solutions in developing truly accountable governments and more open societies, whatever form those take.
Just if I can, before getting to Maiko, from your experience running, DRL, which administers obviously tremendous numbers of programs, what do you see as the most effective or some of the best tools the United States has to do that kind of work? Is it programs and funding? Is it statements, to Abby's point, to lending moral support to those on the ground? Is it diplomats going in and warning the government? I mean, I'm curious for what you see as the most effective, or is it all the above?
I mean, I would say all of the above and an integrated approach, so you don't have, one off key with the other, but the rhetoric has to be matched with resources. And one point I would make is if we look at U.S. development assistance, about 1% of U.S. development assistance goes towards what we would define as peace building, nonviolent action designed to prevent or avert conflict from happening. Everything from capacity building to social cohesion to mediation, et cetera. There is a well-founded base of research showing that if internationally we were to double development assisting, peacebuilding assistance to the 30 most fragile states in the world, this would result in a savings of 2.94 trillion in terms of conflict averted. So I think when we talk about, increasing the assistance, we can't lose sight of, the cost effectiveness of preventing, the next Rohingya crisis from occurring. So I do believe the rhetoric has to be matched by sustained resources and an increase in that area. Mm-hmm.
Talking about Japanese approach to those civil society actors that you talked about, that's the sort of difficult sort of area for Japan, the Japanese government to deal with, especially because Japanese assistance goes through JICA. Through government to government, approach, and so there's not much going on for the support for civil society. And one recent event, I will a rumor that I heard, which I was a bit concerned, was that when I heard some Renzi tried to come to Japan. Some private actor tried to invite some Renzi, but because he has guilty sentence, so there needs a political decision to accept, and he eventually could not enter Japan, and so I thought the Japanese government should. Support those private actors, Japanese private actors, moves to show assistance or moral support for those opposition, people, working for democracy in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, there are some positive sort of moves that the Japanese government has been doing, and one of the things I'm fascinated is that this is also about Cambodia, but after the general election last year, Japan started providing inviting young political leaders from Cambodia, 10 leaders at a time, and they have invited already 3 times, which includes actually opposition young politicians, and also 2 from Rescue Party each time as well. And so, what they are trying to do is to give education about democracy, how Japanese democracy works, how Japanese judiciary works, and Japanese media, and in addition to sort of connecting young political leaders from opposition parties with Hun Sen's party for better communication. So that's I think a kind of positive thing. But but Japan also has to take a more proactive sort of approach on the multilateral venue, I believe, and it was disappointing that Japan abstained when they were voting on the Cambodian issue or Rohingya issues, or even the extrajudicial killing about in the Philippines.
Speaking of that, actually, and how we'll respond, especially multilaterally in the region, we're just at the end. Yesterday, the annual East Asia Summit and the ASEAN series of ASEAN summits that draw the leaders from the region there just ended yesterday. And while we see some of the human rights issues come from time to time, it's obviously not at the top of the agenda. One of the things that I remember from dealing with ASEAN was that I was there when the coup in Thailand happened in 2014, and I remember before the United States had its meetings with the ASEAN countries together, the ASEAN countries had coordinated all of their responses to what they were going to say about the coup in Thailand, and they had basically closed ranks around them and would not say anything critical of Thailand in front of the United States or other countries. So when we got in the room and we'd said something critical, they, of course, were not going to go there with it. So how do you take a situation like that in the region where lots of countries are very, very wary of criticizing one another to try to work multilaterally in supporting these issues in democracy and human rights. Maybe those are first.
I think it's not a situation, limited to Southeast Asia, where, even having worked in the European context as well, I find that often, the United States is expected to go it alone or sort of lead the way in terms of making those more tough public statements. But I think you can have a combination of both, both public pressure as well as, direct engagement to try to express concern. And what's more the issue is if you are completely isolated on the latter point. I think that's, it's really the case for the United States to work behind the scenes to bring others to the table, knowing full well that direct public confrontation is likely not the approach that's going to be a one-size-fits-all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just also to build on Uzo's point before, I think there's a lot of space for working with these countries on things that maybe are not seen as typical issues of governance or civil liberties. There's a lot of human rights issues that don't feed into that. And I think of the Mekong, for instance, which is, talk about a climate crisis. This river is on the verge of dying. It affects almost every country in ASEAN. And this is something where strong leadership, it affects livelihoods, it affects health, it affects, certainly the regional stability in the decades to come. This is a place potentially where there could be more leadership and also more grassroots work by the U.S., by Japan, that doesn't undermine these governments in any particular way, and really supports them and their possibility for stable human rights in the decades to come.
Well, concerning multilateral approach, I'm aware that not only Japan but also other Asian democracies are wanting to play a greater role for the protection of democracy and human rights, yet they are all concerned about taking bilateral approaches to other Asian countries and also to advocate for democracy, or thinking about both sort of alienating, sending strong signal to China, and also to sending strong signal to other Asian countries to choose between China and those democratic partners. And so, what we should think about, I think, is to expand collaboration amongst those democracies in Asia and also with the United States and Australia. To include more actors so that it does not become bilateral approach. And apparently those actors like Institute for Peace and Democracy in Indonesia or India's Election Commission, they have been very active in protecting democracy abroad. And also for Japan, one of the issues that Japan has is that when it goes for seeking information about aid needs in the sector of global good governance, it seeks information from governmental partners in those other Asian countries. And that's, I think, is a major difference from American approach, USAID's approach. When USAID sends a mission, it reaches out not only to governmental actors but also civil society and university professors in a large scale. So I think if Japan and the U.S. could conduct collaborative sort of information digging sort of project for democracy aid needs, that would be great, I think.
So getting specific again when it comes to some of these issues, right? Myanmar jumps out as me, as I was mentioning it before. Senator Markey was mentioning it as one of the most striking and difficult, perhaps, challenges we've faced in the recent years. And there was such sort of enthusiasm over it and what was happening and looked to be the beginning of a democratic transition 7-8 years ago or so, and then obviously the horrible atrocities against the Rohingya, which there were clear signals for a long time about. And so the question I have really is, did the United States get it wrong? Right, the Obama administration sort of jumped in and tried to support what it saw as a democratic transition and thought that that would help the entire situation as much as it could. But was that the right thing to do? And what are we faced with now? Abby, do you want to?
I would go beyond the Rohingya situation, because I think what we've seen in the last few years is also just a real unraveling of the kind of couple years of freedom. I mean, just last weekend we saw 5 young poets imprisoned for a year for satirizing the military and satirizing Suu Kyi. Of course, we have the Reuters journalists. I mean, this is really affecting civil society. This is affecting journalists. And maybe the U.S. did get it wrong. I mean, I think the whole world got it wrong. There was a tendency to, I think, like everyone, we want to have our heroes and we want to have our idols. And as you mentioned, maybe we ignore the kind of systemic problems underneath and could be doing more to work to build those systems rather than let's get this person in power and that will sort everything.
I mean, I think I would second Abby's points, and maybe rather than asking the question, did we get it wrong, but what can we learn? What do we take away? And returning to my earlier points, I think that we have to recognize, if we look at like the leading sources of refugees in the world in terms of countries, the top 5 are all either struggling or failed political transitions. You look at Syria, Myanmar, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia. So, I think it is human nature, and let's face it, particularly in Washington, there's a political calendar as well. At the end of a 4-year cycle, you want to chalk up the victories and the positives, but recognizing that in most cases, these transitions from authoritarianism, it's just the beginning of a long and difficult and often violent journey where, in terms of what we can learn, I would say collectively, like-minded partners, governments, I mean, to me, it's really, it's an integrated multi-stakeholder approach, recognizing that, on 2 levels, I would say you've got to create a horizontal cohesion or help support that within a society, and particularly societies like Myanmar. I mean, you look at the number of active ethnic conflicts in Myanmar. It isn't just between an authoritarian state and citizens, but there's a whole mosaic of people. And then you have, the institution of the security state remaining in control. You could make parallels with Egypt or other examples. So I think, a huge dose of humility, but also a commitment to really try to accompany that path and to build what I would say the horizontal integration and then the vertical one in terms of supporting what is an accountable government system towards its own people. And not something that's imposed from the outside, but looking at, the leverage that the United States, Japan, other democratic champions have and trying to orient that towards a long-term improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, right? Obviously, in the context of everything we're talking about here, outside actors are but a small, part of what eventually happens in any of these countries in terms of actual impact. And I think that's right, the fundamental debate the Obama administration had about Myanmar, but also many countries have about any situation any country going through political transition like this, right? How forward-leaning should they be, and in what ways to try to embrace and push forward what's happening, recognizing that this is a long-term and multifaceted, transition or challenge that's going to happen.
I may add just one point. I think the international society had a too rosy view about Myanmar. When it liberalized in 2012, it was not democratization at all. The military held the veto power. Based on the constitution, 1/4 of the congressional seat was allocated for the military, and so we have to look at the reality without having too much a positive opportunistic optimistic view.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Wanted to just get a couple more questions in, and then allow an opportunity for one or two questions from the audience if there are any. But I feel remiss if we went through an entire discussion of democracy and human rights in Asia and didn't mention Taiwan. This is an issue that obviously can be controversial time to time, but there's obviously a lot of support for Taiwan in Washington, around the world. It is a relatively vibrant democracy, but obviously there is a very, very large neighbor next door that dominates lots of the time decision-making on it. And so I guess my question to you all is, what kind of support do you think the United States, Japan, other countries should be providing to Taiwan when it comes to everything? Economic relationships, security, supporting its own democracy, supporting space for it, international institutions, recognizing that there is this balance to be struck and a dance to do when it comes to dealing with Taiwan. Mike, I don't know if I want to throw to you to start.
Yeah. I think it was wise decision when the Japan Taiwan cultural foundation joined the GCTF Global Cooperation Training Framework this year to co-host it, and so it would be great if Japan could do something more in this sort of a trilateral approach for the support of Taiwan. But Taiwan's civil society has been very advanced from Japanese point of view. They are very good at analyzing sharp power, and they are very active in supporting internal democracy actors as well. And so I'm not too sure whether there will be so much things that Japan would be able to do to support Taiwanese actors bilaterally, but in multilateral sphere, definitely there are a lot to do.
No, I would just second Mako's point in terms of I think within the boundaries of the One China policy, in the multilateral realm, and particularly talking about regional leadership in addressing some of the cross-boundary issues. I mean, just looking at climate change, looking at the donor approach to that, and all of that. I think there are ways for Taiwan to be more integrated and to play, let's say, more of a role as a responsible funder and actor in that space.
Abby, before you wanted to throw Hong Kong in there as well, not entirely unrelated, obviously, in terms of how the United States and others view what's happening right there, and it has the feel sometimes over the last few months as though, any moment something far worse could happen in terms of a much more severe crackdown from Beijing. And Hong Kong is obviously, just like Taiwan, a very, very unique situation, especially in terms of how the United States, Japan, the international community deals with it and approaches Hong Kong. And so I'm curious for thoughts on, what you see happening there and how the United States and others you think should be responding, especially remember your comment before, Abby, about how people on the ground there and elsewhere look, even just for statements of support, comments, right, and they feed off of that.
I mean, I don't know. I'm not a Hong Kong expert. I will say that what's interesting is Taiwan and Hong Kong are looking very closely at each other right now, and Taiwan showed a great deal of leadership with regards to what happened in Taiwan, because it was originally it was about extradition to Taipei, and Taipei turned around and said, "You can pass this law. We're not going to see extradition no matter what. This is absolutely political." And they were kind of the country that first raised flags over this. But I wouldn't venture to guess what will happen. I mean, China relies on Hong Kong being an international financial destination, and so I don't think we will see another Tiananmen, but I'm no China expert, so I'll stop there.
I want to have your optimism.
I mean, I think that it's just vitally important to be prepared, for a deteriorating situation, and to address, in terms of American leadership, a real imperative to speak for what has been a peaceful youth-led movement to hold their government accountable.
Don't call it riots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, first of all, it's very important to give moral support for both Hong Kong and Taiwan actors advocating for democracy. And at the same time, regarding the Hong Kong issue, it might be also sensible to expand for the civil society actors, not only in Japan but also in the entire world, to try to sort of facilitate intergenerational dialogues for peaceful demonstrations in Hong Kong, so that they are not gonna suffer economically and financially, and they are not gonna invite China for intervention.
Yeah.
I would also not understate the importance of modeling good behavior, and I think the behavior America's modeling now is so damaging. And just a few days ago, we set the refugee cap at 18,000, which last year was 30,000, already the lowest in history. By comparison, in 1980 it was 230,000. I think countries look at the U.S. and say, look at that guy. We see how Duterte and Hun Sen really have been pleased with sort of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump White House, and this emboldens, whether it's Trump calling these riots or whether it's simply not putting policies in place in our country. This emboldens this type of bad acting abroad.
Well, you beat me to my final question. No, perfect. Before we see if there are any audience questions, which is exactly that point. With what's happening now in the United States and all of our challenges with the way the Trump administration talks or does not talk about human rights and models perhaps bad behavior, does that affect not just how others act, but does that affect and should affect what we do right now? Do we not have the ability, right, some might argue, right now, to actually be going around the world telling people, as State Department diplomats still do, hopefully, and others suggest and encourage people to stand up for human rights? Obviously, this is not a unique time necessarily in U.S. history with respect to that. We've had plenty of periods in our past with very, very dark blemishes on our own human rights record. But so I'm curious for your thoughts on what we should be doing today and how that impacts our ability to support human rights around the world. Those are.
Well, I would agree with Abby. I think we have to be absolutely clear-eyed that to the degree to which rhetoric like fake news has absolutely been seized upon by Duterte, any number of other authoritarian leaders to justify their own very coercive repression of media. So that's one clear-cut example. I think with respect to refugee policy, it's another one with respect to the historic low in U.S. refugee admissions and our pulling out of the negotiations on the Global Migration Pact. It makes it more difficult to maintain credibility in asking other countries to treat refugees and asylum seekers in accordance with international obligations. But all of that aside, I would say, the United States is more than one person. The United States government is more than one person. And I think tools such as the Global Magnitsky Act, looking at, U.S. Diplomatic development security policy writ large. There are, many levers. There are many ways that we can wield influence, and I don't believe that has been cut off by any means, because the U.S., like it or not, remains a preeminent actor globally, and there is, I'd say, a unique anticipation or expectation for how the U.S. will respond in these kinds of situations that I think still persists despite all of the changes.
I think that's a incredibly salient point too, especially having Senator Markey come here, illustrative of the role that Congress can and is playing sometimes, its efforts to end the war in Yemen, other examples, things that it can do to push the administration and others. Michael, do you want to?
Well, the fact that Trump has been spreading this symbolic impact, negative impact for democracy is partially partially influence of this very democratic, diverse journalism that you have in the United States. Not only Trump himself spreading news on his own via SNS, but also investigative journalism has been covering Trump's disinformation campaign or the Russia affairs and so and Ukraine and so forth. And so it's a wonderful thing. You should talk more about those functions that journalism has for a healthy democracy in the country. And also, I think there's too much spotlight on Trump. And as Senator Markey was talking about. The State Department's actual support for democracy is not really well spread around the world, and so I think that message should be spread too.
Point. Before, just have a couple of minutes before we close. If wanted to see if there are any questions from the audience, just please identify yourself first, sir.
Thank you. My name's Andre, good friend. Just in talking about the promoting democracy, often we're talking about promoting the rule by the will of the people. I mean, that's how it often comes across. And certainly in populist movements, this talk about the unfiltered rule of the people, unconstrained by laws made by an elite, which essentially is how liberal democracy helps mitigate some of the extremes of majoritarian democracy. How do we, since this type of will of the people is what is understood in many of these transition societies, that what they are going to be getting is a move away from authoritarianism to will of the people, how do we adjust our narrative in promoting democracy to highlight that there should be or there must be this constraint by rule of law first in order to mitigate some of these extremes?
I mean, I think part of it, Andre, and correct me if I'm wrong, your past experience, you're still serving in the State Department. I think it's institutions. You need a combination of a universal rights space that allows for the free and the robust expression of all views, including views that can be quite noxious or even hateful, but to have the institutions in place that allow for peaceful discourse, that allow for all of that to hopefully result in better results for the population at large. I don't think we want to go down a road of an either or. And, you've brought up a very important point here in terms of just the direction, the disruptive, amplifying effect of technology to put forward, and unite, let's say, more fringe views. How do you manage that without creating new forms of censorship within a society, or trying to suggest that, a static, tradition-bound liberal order is the only solution? I mean, one point I should have made earlier is even when we talk about democratic systems, again, I think we have to do so with an enormous amount of humility coming from the United States and recognize that our model has a very tragic history itself, and it's rather unique in terms of the bipartisan nature if you look at the direction of the rest of the world. So that's not really much of an answer there, but I think you make an important point that I think we don't want to simply suggest that this is one order or one model, that's more of a restoration approach as opposed to something that I think really has to be driven from within a country in reflection of its unique history, traditions, and dynamics, and its past model.
I think, well, on that point, diversification of norms would be another thing we should think about. From Japanese point of view, I think Japanese government had trial and error when it comes to what values they should focus on. And in mid 2000s, they were talking about democracy, human rights, freedom, and market capitalism as important universal norms. But later on, especially since 2017 or so, I think they started talking more about rule of law, transparency, and accountability, because those governance norms are something that is acceptable for authoritarian countries as well. They are not easily deniable. But I do not mean that we should give up on those norms like democracy and human rights, but diversification would be great.
Maybe take one last question for here.
Thank you. My name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. I spent some time in Korea. I noticed that North Korea has been absent from this discussion. I wonder if the panelists might have a view on the extent to which human rights in North Korea should be made an issue in U.S. negotiations or attempts at negotiations with North Korea. The whole emphasis has been on North Korea's nuclear and missile program. But how much should the U.S. try to interject human rights into the dialogue, knowing, of course, that North Korea hates that topic and denies any violations of human rights?
I mean, I think the problem is that the U.S. has virtually no leverage when it comes to North Korea. So we can talk about human rights. We can sanction them. There was a great report that just came out about the effects of sanctions, saying something like 4,000 people have died from illnesses and deaths directly related to the most recent round of sanctions. That means nothing to the North Korean government. I think it's important for the U.S. to talk about human rights when they're having these discussions, perhaps as a means of virtue signaling. This is something that we care about. We're not going to forget about it. But in terms of making an impact on the country, my understanding is that we have next to nil influence.
I would just add that I think there is an obligation for the United States to speak out on the absolutely just deplorable rock bottom human rights situation in North Korea, where you have the generational incarceration and punishment of families, and absolutely horrific stories from those North Koreans who have managed to escape that system. I think that the United States, working with like-minded partners, was able to, under the previous administration, to shed a light on that absolutely deplorable situation through the Commission of Inquiry on North Korea. I share Abby's view that we shouldn't have illusions about the near-term effect in changing regime behavior, but I do believe that accountability and documentation of what is happening is vitally important. And so I do think, with respect to American engagement, it does have a place, absolutely, and in our public messaging as well. And to look the other way, I think, undercuts us on all accounts.
And I would just add one final note on that. I completely agree with both Abby and Uzra. I think that it needs to be on the agenda. We need to continue to shine a spotlight on it through multiple different mechanisms that we have. But one of the other things I think is important to note is that there are lots of people, lots of different views on this, but part of it depends, I think, on what your theory of change in North Korea is. How do you think you can best influence the overall situation in North Korea? And I think some people would argue also that the only way you're going to get improvements on a significant scale in human rights is by changing the security situation on the peninsula and how the regime views its security situation. And so that's one argument for focusing on the nuclear weapons stuff first to try to get at the others, but you cannot let anything fall off the agenda when it comes to human rights, I think, at the same time. All right. I think we were at 11 o'clock. Just wanted to thank my panelists and ask you to join me in thanking them today. And thank you all.